Hello and welcome to the Hub podcast. My name is Eric Berger, Marketing Communications Manager for VolunteerHub, the industry-leading volunteer management software that helps nonprofits better recruit, engage, and manage volunteers. One of the biggest differentiators about VolunteerHub software is our post-sales support. We hear from clients all the time about their positive experience onboarding. So today I wanted to talk with Matthew Murphy, VolunteerHub's implementation and training manager, and just discuss 10 frequently asked questions that we get about our implementation, training, and support process. Hey, Matthew, thanks for taking the time to speak with me. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am doing great. So I mentioned in the intro that one of the biggest differentiators here at VolunteerHub is our post-sales implementation and training process. We hear a lot from clients about how great our process is and how much support they feel like they're given. So the purpose of this podcast is just to kind of answer some of the most frequently asked questions that we get. So I'm hoping that you can address some of these questions. And the first one is, what is the timeline for completing implementation and training?
This is a question I get all the time. And this is probably the hardest question to answer because it's so specific to each organization. I guess the variables that would come into play first would be like how much time does every organization or each organization have to invest in getting things set up, but also kind of the setup and structure of each organization. So it's going to be different for maybe an organization that has a couple things that happen in a single location versus, sometimes I'm setting up VolunteerHub, an instance, a site for an organization that has locations across the country or spanning the globe. So kind of what's needed is going to come into play for that, but also, what is the background knowledge of the person and the organization? How much has been planned out ahead of time? What do you want the structure to be? What is the onboarding process? What are the different things that happen? So that's definitely something I can answer a lot better after we start meeting and I get an idea. But, to give an actual answer, which is what people want, I'd say on average it's 4 to 6 weeks. That's assuming doing, 2, 3-ish training sessions, maybe, a week apart. But obviously, yeah, it's just hard to answer because of, what is everybody's time.
And I know this next question may be hard to answer, but as far as the learning curve, so what is the learning curve like for admins learning this new system from your experience?
So some of that kind of blends in with what I was just saying about like the background knowledge of the people I'm talking about. So as far as like, is it difficult to use VolunteerHub? I don't think so. And generally the feedback I get is that it isn't. Our development team puts a lot of emphasis into ease of use, like not putting a million buttons all over the place. Like, is what you are trying to accomplish set up in a logical fashion? And that's kind of how VolunteerHub works. Like, even if it's a feature you haven't used, it should be set up in a way that where you expect a button or a feature to exist is where it exists. And that's generally the feedback I get. There's obviously going to be, with every system, there's some quirks, like, you got to learn a little bit of kind of the skeleton of what makes the system work, which in our case would be like the event groups and the user groups. But once you get that foundational part of the site set up, a lot of it is pretty self-explanatory. Like I always tell people, once that's in place, like creating an event, that I could probably skip and everyone would be able to figure out, because you're essentially just filling out a form. What is the event? Where is it? When is it? So it's kind of getting past that initial setup, and then the use of VolunteerHub is a lot easier, and that's the feedback I generally get from organizations.
Yeah, I like that you talked about ease of use and usability. I think that's obviously important for not just new admins coming into the system, but also all clients that are using our software. But I think you touched on this So this would be the third question, and that is training customized for each organization, or is training a one-size-fits-all approach?
So I guess specifically what we're talking about is implementation. So starting with that, like implementing a new site, most certainly not one size fits all, because there are generally similarities about how organizations work, but every organization is going to structure things a little different. I mentioned before, like some organizations might have just one set of things that volunteers do at one location versus an organization that has 10 locations across 10 different states. Like that's going to be different. So that's what we do in the lead up to and the beginning of implementation is, I'm gathering information about what's the structure of what happens, what's the structure of the volunteers. Like, are you using, is it mostly individuals? Are there groups coming? What's the onboarding process like? Are there specific roles, like only people approved for driving should be able to sign up for driving? So that's very customized and very specific to each organization. And that's generally how we start VolunteerHub, like the setup, where I was mentioning like the event groups and user groups being kind of a specific thing. Now, once you get past that, it does kind of change into being a little more, like I said, it doesn't matter what the organization is or what they do. Generally, creating an event is the same. So it does get easier. And that's something, and I'm sure we'll talk about later with like other resources. We have resources on our support site, and I do webinars, and some of those are kind of a one size fits all, because we're covering a topic that it doesn't matter what the organization is, using that feature or kind of the setup of it would be the same. But certainly, as far as implementation is concerned, it is very structured to how do we set this up that is both how the organization wants to function and meeting all their needs, but also how does that translate into a setup in VolunteerHub that's utilizing VolunteerHub as efficiently and seamlessly, so once it's set up, it can just be used.
So you basically prioritize organizations being able to use VolunteerHub in a way that's going to be beneficial to them, and that starts with implementation. That's kind of what you're saying.
Exactly.
So yeah, one size fits all approach wouldn't work in that instance, because some clients may want to use VolunteerHub differently than others.
Mm-hmm.
And that implementation process is kind of the start of their success with the software.
Yeah.
Are implementation sessions recorded?
So we do not record the implementation sessions. Now, I'd mentioned that we do have a lot of recorded content, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later as well, that a lot of the things we do cover, especially the things that are more universal, like I keep going back to creating an event, like we have recorded content for that. I mentioned webinars, all those are recorded. So we do have that content available, and that's content that as VolunteerHub changes with time, new features are added, changes are made, improvements, that content gets updated, which is probably, kind of the main reason the implementation sessions aren't recorded, is they could quickly become out of date as new things are added. And I think part of the reason people ask me, are these recorded, is usually it's not that the person asking the question is going to go back and watch it, because they were in the session and they have the notes and they have all the materials that we're providing, and they can always ask me and ask support. They're normally asking it for a future coworker that doesn't work there yet, and wanting that person to have access to the materials that were used to set up the site. But again, that could become out of date. And I'm sure, again, we'll talk in a little bit about other resources available. Like we have other mechanisms in place for getting a person like that up to speed. One of the webinars, and probably one of the most viewed webinars that I've done, is So You Inherited a VolunteerHub Site, Now What? Which kind of bridges, is used for that purpose of getting people to understand what system is already in place. So that was a very long answer to say we don't record them, but that's kind of the why. And the feedback I've gotten is that makes sense, and that we provide enough updated materials that someone wouldn't necessarily even want to go back and watch the initial videos of their implementation sessions.
Well, and we're constantly focused on improvement of the software, so adding new features happens all the time, and that kind of goes back into the usability, ease of use of our software, trying to add features to make things easier on people and add additional functionality. So I think that makes sense. And you touched upon the resources that we have available. Can you kind of go into that in a little bit more detail, as far as the knowledge base and other resources that are available for admins post implementation?
Yeah, so I'll start with actually during implementation. So after our first session, I always send an email. I call it the homework email. And it's really more an outline of everything we're going to cover with direct links to each topic. So more content than we actually would have covered in that first session. Just I hate inundating people with needless emails. So it's kind of a full syllabus with links to all the written content, all the videos covering all the topics that we'll do. It also has a link to our going live checklist, because some people do like to start with the end in mind. What's that end goal? What are we building towards? Once implementation is over, I send another email with some more resources, some things that now with the context of hindsight of the site being set up would make more sense. And again, the same link to the going live checklist, but links to more resources, links to contacting support, as well as our webinars. I do quarterly webinars, and those are always posted in our news feed, like when it's coming up, what the topic is going to be, which of course people could sign up and attend, but they're all of course recorded, posted to a YouTube playlist, which when that happens, that's also posted to the administrative news feed, just to let people know. But all of that is made available, so you can always go in. All of that's available through the support site. I also will do, or I guess I should say I offer, not everyone takes advantage, but based on feedback from having done so many implementations, a lot of the time you don't necessarily know what questions you're going to have until you get in to do it. And of course, everyone that uses VolunteerHub has access to support, so you can always send questions to support, get those answered. And that's definitely the best avenue for like an immediate answer, especially post-implementation, is contacting support. But I also put in that final kind of wrap-up end of implementation email a link to schedule a follow-up call. And this is, you can pick a 15 or 30 minute, again, totally optional. And I think most people don't end up using it because they'll have questions, but support will have answered them. But you can schedule kind of either right before you go live. Some people like me to go in and try to find anything that might be, like just give it kind of one last look over. Or sometimes people schedule it for right after, because they might have kind of a list of questions, and instead of just a one-off question they send to support, they might want to kind of go through and do a screen share to cover those. And I'm always open. I tell people to feedback. So a lot of the time, the reason the resources exist is because we know people need them, all the webinars and the video content. But if someone goes to look for content or some resource that doesn't exist, the reason it might not exist might just be because we're not aware of the fact that anyone was looking for it. So always, we are looking for that feedback of what can we do, what can we provide to make things easier.
So what happens if an admin needs additional one-on-one training after implementation?
So I guess kind of the process, once implementation is over, then in our system, we have, we track everything that's going on. So I'll mark implementation over. So that will lead to two direct things that happen. One is that then opens the ability for that organization to contact support. So obviously they have access to support. It also sets a countdown approximately 3 months after implementation. The client success manager for that organization will reach out to them to do kind of a check-in to see how things are going. And I also mentioned there's the option of that additional, I call it like a follow-up session, 15 or 30 minute. But if beyond that, a need for more training comes up, generally that's going to either spawn from a communication with support. So maybe questions to support lead to either the organization themselves or support thinking, hey, we might need like a training intervention, or client success might either decide that, or the organization would have reached out to their client success manager and said, hey, we want to discuss, we need some more training. So if we get to that point, then there's kind of a fork in the road of, is it something quick, in which case we can do another 15 or 30 minute, or we also have additional like 1 hour formal training sessions that they can purchase through their client success manager. And those tend to also involve me doing a little more prep work. I'll gather information. What is it we want to cover? What's the end goal? Is there a problem we're trying to solve, or is it just an explanation? And I'll write up agendas and do a deeper dive into their site to really make sure that that session is entirely tailored to what that organization does and how we can come to a resolution.
And I think you made a good point when a new admin comes into the system. So, when an organization brings on a new volunteer coordinator or manager, whoever it be that's going to be using the system, do we offer any implementation support, or I should say training support for that person who's coming in?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that would happen is, as far as in VolunteerHub, is someone would have granted them admin access. So whether it's an existing administrator created that account, or they had the new person create an account and then made them usually a super user. So full admin access to the site. When a new super user is created on a site, that person will get an automatic email. So we send an email to that person that has links to some of the resources I was already mentioning. So we have the webinars. So generally they'd want to maybe kind of peruse through our getting started as a new administrator webinar, which that one is good because it builds that foundational knowledge of what are the different pieces of VolunteerHub and what's the lingo mean? What is an event group or a user group or a user form or a landing page? Also links directly to the So You Inherited a VolunteerHub site. Now what? Which kind of gives them, here's kind of the do's and don'ts of being an administrator on an existing site. Like, what is it that you want to change now that you're in charge, but what are the things maybe you want to leave alone? Like, what should you not delete? We also link to some of our frequently asked knowledge base articles. Like, what are the things that new administrators, generally from experience from our support team, like what are the questions that they would get, so we can kind of preemptively, we have like a list of those with the answers. And I keep going back to my 15, 30-minute meetings. We also in that email include a link to schedule that. Now, I generally would recommend to people kind of go through those other resources first before scheduling maybe 15 or 30 minutes to talk to me. Because if you start with talking to me, I'm probably going to have to spend that time explaining what is VolunteerHub. Whereas if you go through those other resources that were made available in that email, you can go into the meeting saying, okay, I already know what the system is and kind of how it works, and the questions that they can ask and the things we can cover can be directly related to their organization. So that all just happens when their account's made. And then, other things that would be at their disposal would be the things we were just talking about, kind of post-implementation. Obviously, they can contact support, they can contact their client success manager. So we really try to make things that no one has to dig for it, because if you're a new administrator, you were probably just hired and you've got a lot of things going on. So as much as we can alleviate extra tasks and just say, here's everything you would need, let us know what we can do. And having feedback on that has been good.
When a new feature is released, and I think you talked about this too, how do admins know that feature is available?
It's a very timely question because I just pushed out release notes today. So the first thing that would happen is that now, I guess really the first thing might be that you notice a new feature, I guess, depending on what it is. But when an administrator logs in to their VolunteerHub site and goes to the admin side. We have that news feed on the right. So that's, me posting, I mentioned like webinars. We cross post. So you create a lot of great material for marketing that gets cross posted there. And that was another thing, again, based on feedback. Eric, you were creating lots of material for our marketing site that really was beneficial, like for existing administrators, and we got that feedback that people liked having quick access to that content, tips and tricks or interviews with other organizations. And I cross post that to that news feed. So that's worth, I always tell people to check that out. But I always tell people that if you really only have time for one thing that you see posted in that news feed, it should be release notes. So the release notes will be posted there. And the release notes will always be a direct, relevant list of changes or new features. So I always tell people you'll never open it and it's going to say, we optimized the server and we squashed some bugs, because that's just inherently understood that that's always happening. So that way, if people see release notes, they know it's worth reading. So that's made available there. And people can also, if you'd rather get an email, that's possible as well. And that's something that we have information about. We have a knowledge base article that explains it. But essentially, if you go to the support sites, there's an option there to create an account. And sometimes people get confused thinking, why would I need an account there? And you don't need an account on the support site to just utilize the knowledge base and use the site and contact support. But if you do create an account on the support site, it gives you a couple things you can do. One is it gives you a way of keeping track of your past communication with support. Like you can go back and view a history of all your tickets. But it also allows you to, and the term on the support site is follow, but essentially subscribe. So in the there's a pane on the right that would be showing like the news articles, and if you open that up, there's a follow button where anytime a new kind of news post is put, you'd get an email that it's been posted there with a link to that article.
If we kind of shift gears a little bit, I know we've been talking about what resources we provide admins, but do we offer any kind of training resources that clients can share with volunteers on how to use VolunteerHub?
Yes. So I mentioned that when implementation's over, I send that kind of wrap-up email. And one of the things in that is a link. It says volunteer guides. So on the support site, almost the entirety of the support site, the audience for all those articles would be administrators, but there is a section with guides for volunteers. And again, this was something based on feedback. So this didn't used to exist. And then people were asking, do you have it? It's like, no, but we will. So I started making, collecting what were the things, the questions, and some of this was questions that actual volunteers had asked administrators. I think a lot of it was preemptively questions administrators were thinking that volunteers would ask and wanted to preemptively have something to provide them. So I took those and made quick reference guides. So they're a little different than the other articles. Like the knowledge base articles for administrators are generally pretty long. Like I write out everything. It's full explanations and step-by-step and screenshots and use cases and videos. For volunteers, that's too much. So they're posted that you can go to the article and look at them, but most of them are also like you can click to download the PDF, and it's screenshots with either an explanation written over the feature, or normally it's a step-by-step guide. So things like utilizing and creating an account in VolunteerHub, which is probably the longest one. It goes through, how do you create an account? What does that process look like? How would you reset your password if you needed to? And then once you're in the site, what are the different buttons and how do you find things? Which again, my hope would be that most people wouldn't need something like that, because VolunteerHub is set up in a way that is logical to people that have used similar systems. But also, a step-by-step guide how to use the kiosk or how to use a QR code, like checking into events. And that's something I tell people at the end of implementation, that that's in there as well if you wanted to send any of those things out, or if you wanted to use them, because obviously they're not, they're screenshots, so it's not specific to any organization site. It's from one of my demo sites that I use. So if you really wanted to, you could basically use those as a template to create your own content with your own screenshots if you wanted to, and maybe send that out when you're initially launching Volunteer Hub to just provide people with kind of a step-by-step. But I tell people that those resources are in there, and that's a great example of, I initially didn't have any of that content because I didn't think about it. Because we're not the ones using Volunteer Hub. So that feedback is so important from the people that are actually using it, working with volunteers. So letting us know, hey, this resource or this content would be helpful. So, if there's anything that doesn't exist, it probably doesn't exist just because no one has mentioned that it would be relevant. It's been a while since anyone's asked for any new content, so I feel like we've got a really good handle on what people are needing and what they're experiencing, but 100% always open to kind of feedback and recommendations from administrators about what else we could provide.
So I think last question, and we talked about feedback. So I think feedback is a good place to kind of end the interview. But how do we use client feedback to optimize our implementation and training process? How do we make it better with that feedback?
But what we do in implementation is always evolving. So it makes me think back to when I first started. So the first time I learned how volunteer worked, and now I'm doing implementations myself. And I'm pausing because I'm remembering all the fear of starting and like not knowing like what are the questions people are going to ask and do I know the answers. And it was really based on that initially, was what are the questions people are asking me, and noticing that those questions were happening over and over. So that's a direct indication to me that, well, people are asking these things and they tend to ask them at the same times in our setup process. That must mean that is exactly where I should explain that. So preemptively answering. So that became what I tried to do to kind of mold what the implementation process was, to already have a handle on what people are going to ask and answer it right before they would ask. And already know what their follow-up questions would be to provide that. So that's always been what I'm trying to accomplish, is how can I feed in and know what someone is going to be thinking. And I guess to provide, some feedback, some background on me, I mentioned that my degree is in world history, but my master's is in education, and specifically teaching English to speakers of other languages. So that's what I did before kind of getting into like software implementation and training, like technology training, was teaching English to speakers of other languages, people of diverse backgrounds, speaking different languages, sometimes English not even being their second, maybe their third or fourth. And that's what that job is trying to get good at reading people and having an idea of what they might be thinking, and they might not even be able to express it because of a language barrier. And setting up, whether we're talking about Volunteer Hub or anything with technology, it's the exact same thing. I'm happy to tell my mother that I am definitely using my degree, because the language now that I'm teaching is technology to, again, people of diverse backgrounds. So using that same skill of kind of reading off the person I'm talking to, because sometimes I can tell that the person I'm talking to has a background in this. I can move a little faster and maybe not go as deep into explanation, whereas maybe this is all very new to them. Not only Volunteer Hub, but a system like this in general, maybe moving from using Excel spreadsheets or literal pieces of paper. So that's also client feedback, and changes what the implementation might be and how things are approached. But using, I guess, the repository of information I have in my head of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of implementation sessions with hundreds and hundreds of different organizations, reading that situation, trying to read the people and using that to guide what the implementation is going to be. So that's a big part for me that I'm always actively doing. But like you mentioned feedback as well, and I've been talking about that kind of this whole time, that we as an organization, not just implementation, but are always gathering feedback through many different avenues, whether it's, I mentioned that end of implementation email. One of the things in there is a link to a survey. So anonymous surveys that I can use to gather feedback. That's what led to me doing those follow-up sessions, because I was seeing people were thinking or saying, hey, it'd be great to have one last debrief before going live, so adding that to it. Also, just, people just mentioning things. I'm always writing that down. Emails that we get, support tickets, talking to client success, gathering feedback. We have a feature request section on our support site where people can, submit ideas for new features or improvements and vote on what others have done. So that's what kind of can help to guide what our development process is for new features, because we want to be adding things that are of value to the most people. And again, because we are not the ones that are necessarily using VolunteerHub with, on the ground with the volunteers, so that feedback is invaluable. So always making sure that we're gathering that and sharing it with others and using it to improve not only our own processes, but again, you have to share it with others because it could improve their process as well. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, I think this interview has been highly valuable, and I think it just reinforces how we prioritize our implementation, training, and our support process. So I just want to thank you, Matthew, for taking the time out of your really, really, really busy day to speak with me and answer some of these frequently asked questions about implementation and training. And if you're an organization looking for a way to better recruit, engage, and manage volunteers, but also wants to work with a provider who prioritizes your success, request a demo of Volunteer Hub today.